So there I was, my beat-up Honda Civic still ticking from the 200-mile drive when this woman in a power suit clicks across my gravel driveway in stilettos that probably cost more than my monthly rent and hands me a $750 fine like she's delivering divorce papers. Apparently, my moving truck was violating the visual standards of Pine Ridge Commons. I'm Marcus, and I hadn't even grabbed my first box when this HOA vice president, let's call her Victoria because that's literally what's on her business card, pulls out a tablet loaded with violation photos like she's running a surveillance operation. 16 infractions total, fence staining, window trim color, even my doorbell was the wrong shade of brass. Hell, she probably would have cited me for parking crooked if the driveway wasn't perfectly straight. Standing there reeking of expensive perfume and authority, she informs me I've got 72 hours to pay $3,200 or face legal action. But here's what made me grin. Victoria had absolutely no idea she'd just cornered the guy who manages her apartment complex. What would you do if some HOA dictator hit you with fines before you even found your coffee maker? Where are you watching from? And what's your craziest HOA power trip story? Let me rewind and explain how I ended up in this suburban nightmare. 4 months earlier, I was living in Tampa, running property management for a real estate investment firm that decided my entire division was redundant efficiency optimization. 18 years of keeping their portfolios profitable, and they handed me a pink slip and a security escort to the parking garage. The icing on the cake. My ex-girlfriend chose that exact week to announce she was keeping our shared condo and moving in with her CrossFit trainer, a guy named Blaze, who apparently bench presses small cars for fun. So when Great Uncle Theodore's estate attorney called to say he'd left me his place in North Carolina, it felt like divine intervention. Theodore was my grandfather's younger brother, this quiet man who could fix any engine ever made, and still found time to volunteer at 3 different animal shelters. After Aunt Ruby died of cancer, he kept their house like a shrine to their 40-year marriage, tending her flower beds and feeding every stray dog within a 10-mile radius. Here's what 2 decades in property management teaches you. Always examine the CC&Rs before you sign anything, especially when dealing with homeowners associations. HOAs are basically mini dictatorships with all the corruption potential, but zero accountability. Pro tip, HOA board members have the same fiduciary responsibilities as corporate executives, which means they can face personal lawsuits for financial misconduct. Remember that? It becomes important later. The house sits on a half-acre lot in Pine Ridge Commons, a 52-home community that started as affordable family housing in 1981 but transformed into pretentious suburbia over the decades. Now it's the kind of place where people lease BMWs they can't afford, but still use coupons at Target. Monthly HOA dues had mysteriously inflated to $220, supposedly covering groundskeeping, tennis court maintenance, and community standards monitoring, which sounds exactly as threatening as it actually is. I should have suspected trouble when the lawyer mentioned Theodore had some ongoing conflicts with the homeowners association, but honestly, I assumed it was typical senior citizen stuff. Maybe he planted vegetables instead of decorative shrubs or committed the unforgivable sin of displaying a garden statue. Naive fool that I was. So there I am, September humidity making the pavement shimmer like a mirage when Victoria emerges from her gleaming white Tesla like some corporate Terminator. This woman is peak HOA authority figure, the type who dominated student government in college and never recovered from the rush of power. Her business attire costs more than most people's mortgage payments, and she's carrying this professional tablet like she's conducting a forensic investigation instead of harassing new residents. She begins documenting my property with military precision, that camera app clicking faster than a telegraph operator during wartime. The sound made my teeth ache. Then she produces these laminated violation forms. We're talking premium materials with official seals and my address already printed in corporate fonts. This wasn't spontaneous harassment. This was calculated bureaucratic intimidation. Unauthorized commercial signage detected on personal vehicle, she announces, gesturing at the faded company stickers on my Civic. Never mind that it's my personal car. Apparently having Tampa Property Services on the bumper makes you a zoning violation waiting to happen. Unapproved botanical modifications observed in landscape zones, she continues, pointing dramatically at Great Uncle Theodore's azaleas. These magnificent purple blooms that had been thriving there since Reagan was president were suddenly contraband because nobody had submitted Form 42C to the Holy Committee of Aesthetic Control. Exterior hardware exhibits finished deterioration exceeding tolerance parameters. I kid you not, she actually said tolerance parameters like she was diagnosing structural failure. The mailbox had maybe 2 rust spots barely visible unless you were actively searching for imperfections. But here's what really grabbed my attention. While she's conducting this theatrical audit, I notice neighbors watching from behind Venetian blinds like they're witnessing a public execution. These aren't casual observers. These people look genuinely traumatized. An elderly man across the street quickly closed his garage door when Victoria glanced his direction. A woman watering her plants suddenly discovered urgent indoor business requiring immediate attention. That's when Victoria delivers the knockout punch. The previous property owner also struggled with compliance standards before his unfortunate departure. The way she said unfortunate departure made my blood freeze, like Theodore's death was just another administrative inconvenience. I maintained my composure, requested copies of the HOA bylaws and financial statements. You'd have thought I asked for her browser history and tax returns. Suddenly, everything was restricted documentation requiring proper authorization channels and board approval procedures. When I casually mentioned my background in commercial property management, her professional mask cracked slightly. The polite smile wavered, revealing something predatory lurking beneath. She promised appropriate enforcement protocols and clicked away, leaving me with $3,200 in questionable fines and the unmistakable feeling I'd just been marked for elimination. But here's what Victoria didn't realize. I don't just manage properties, I own several of them, including, as fate would have it, the luxury apartment complex where she lives. The next morning brought a certified letter shoved through my mail slot like a legal grenade. Victoria had escalated overnight, deploying psychological warfare tactics that would impress a Pentagon strategist. This wasn't merely a violation notice, this was a comprehensive legal assault wrapped in HOA letterhead and sealed with the kind of administrative malice that could fuel a totalitarian regime. The document demanded immediate payment of all penalties, now mysteriously expanded to $4,150 thanks to processing charges and penalty fees that had apparently reproduced like bacteria overnight. She'd included time-stamped photographs from multiple angles, professional documentation that would make crime scene investigators jealous, and threats of property liens within 45 days. This woman had copied everyone from the community management firm to some attorney whose credentials suggested he specialized in foreclosing on widows' homes. But here's where Victoria made her first strategic miscalculation. She assumed I was just another intimidated homeowner who'd surrender faster than France in 1940. What she failed to recognize is that 18 years managing commercial properties teaches you one essential survival skill: how to read the legal fine print that everyone else ignores, like software license agreements. So I did what any rational person would do, drove straight to the county courthouse. If you've never experienced this particular bureaucratic wasteland, imagine the post office's angrier sibling: fluorescent lighting that makes corpses look healthy, the musty aroma of ancient paperwork mixed with despair, and clerks who treat every request like a personal insult to their family heritage. But county records are public information, which means Victoria's little empire had to follow actual laws instead of whatever regulations she invented during her wine club meetings. What I discovered there was more scandalous than a reality show finale. The original 1985 HOA covenants resembled Victoria's current enforcement about as much as a bicycle resembles a space shuttle. The founding document was roughly 15 pages of reasonable neighbor guidelines. Maintain your property decently. Don't paint your house like a circus tent. Don't operate a junkyard in your driveway. Basic common sense stuff. But somehow over the years, this sensible agreement had evolved into a 53-page authoritarian constitution covering everything from approved holiday decorations to mandatory pet registration procedures. I recalled reading somewhere that major HOA rule modifications require actual homeowner approval. And if those votes never occurred, the new regulations carry about as much legal authority as a grocery shopping list. Even better, Great Uncle Theodore's property enjoyed special grandfather protections for existing landscaping. Those azaleas Victoria was hyperventilating about were specifically safeguarded under the original covenant as established mature plantings with historical community value. Her violation notice carried roughly the same legal weight as a restaurant menu, but the real goldmine was buried in the HOA's financial documentation. As a property owner, I had complete rights to examine them, and what I found made my commercial property management brain start calculating like a supercomputer during tax season. Numbers that didn't reconcile, expenses more inflated than a Thanksgiving Day parade balloon, and a budget that appeared designed by someone who learned accounting from fortune cookie messages. That's when Eleanor materialized. And I mean materialized like some kind of neighborhood intelligence network fairy godmother. This 82-year-old retired accountant had been monitoring me from her kitchen window and apparently decided I looked trustworthy enough for some serious community intelligence. "You're questioning the HOA finances," she whispered, scanning the area like we were planning a prison break. "Excellent. Someone finally needs to." The binder Eleanor presented was thick enough to stop rifle bullets. She'd been documenting Victoria's campaign of terror with the systematic precision of someone who'd spent 45 years organizing financial records for major corporations. 15 families targeted over 3 years, all following identical strategies: excessive penalties, impossible deadlines, forced sales below market value. And whose property management company kept securing those distressed listings? 3 guesses, and the first 2 are automatically wrong. 4 elderly homeowners had already been systematically driven from their properties. Mrs. Chen got hammered for a fence post that tilted maybe 3 degrees from vertical. The Williams family was penalized for excessive recreational equipment visibility because their children had the nerve to leave a soccer ball on their own lawn. Mr. Giuseppe, a Navy veteran, received citations because his American flag was allegedly improperly proportioned for standard residential display. That afternoon, Victoria returned with reinforcements, her husband Derek sporting some kind of official-looking badge he'd probably ordered from the same website security guards buy their equipment. They demanded access to inspect for interior compliance violations, which was apparently legitimate in Victoria's alternate legal reality. I politely refused, citing minor details like constitutional amendments and basic property rights. Derek started photographing through my windows like some discount surveillance operative, which is when I decided to plant my first strategic seed. "Interesting thing," I said, loud enough for eavesdropping neighbors to hear. "The HOA budget shows $55,000 in maintenance contracts, but the actual service providers only received $22,000. Makes you wonder where that other $33,000 disappeared to." The silence was so profound you could have heard a mosquito cough. Victoria cycled through more facial expressions than a mime having a nervous breakdown, and Derek suddenly remembered he had pressing business elsewhere. They retreated to their Tesla faster than roaches fleeing kitchen lights, but not before Victoria promised serious legal ramifications for harassment and defamation. I just smiled and offered a friendly wave. After all, I was barely getting started. Victoria's response to my little accounting observation was immediate and about as subtle as a sledgehammer through stained glass. The next morning, I'm enjoying my coffee and reading the sunrise when a municipal code enforcement vehicle appears. Out steps this apologetic inspector who looks like he'd prefer to be investigating actual problems. "Received a complaint regarding an abandoned commercial vehicle," he explains, checking his clipboard with all the enthusiasm of someone reading their own death certificate. He examines my perfectly legal Civic, discovers absolutely nothing wrong, and apologizes for the inconvenience. But before departing, he leans closer. "Anonymous tip arrived at 5:30 a.m. Caller provided exact address and vehicle description, pretty detailed for a random passerby." 3 hours later, I receive a call from the State Contractor Licensing Authority. Apparently someone had filed a complaint alleging I was operating an unlicensed business from my residence. The investigator was professional but obligated to ask, "Are you currently running Tampa Property Services from your North Carolina address?" I explained my relocation, confirmed I wasn't operating any business, and noted the decals were remnants from my previous employment. Case dismissed in 6 minutes, but the message rang crystal clear. Victoria was escalating to psychological warfare. That night, around 1:30 a.m., I detect footsteps on gravel outside. Living alone sharpens your hearing for sounds that don't belong, and these definitely didn't belong. I peek through the curtains just in time to observe a white Tesla cruising past like some suburban surveillance vehicle. The following morning brings artistic vandalism to my mailbox. Nothing explicitly obscene, just random spray paint designed to manufacture another violation. There's also a decorative pile of dog excrement on my front steps, positioned with the kind of precision suggesting this wasn't random canine expression. Fortunately, I'd installed security cameras the previous day. Property management teaches you healthy paranoia. Too many tenants who interpret security deposits as voluntary suggestions rather than binding obligations. The footage was magnificent. Victoria's Tesla circling at 1:47 a.m., clear shots of her license plate, and Derek skulking around my property like the world's most incompetent cat burglar. But while Victoria was playing amateur vandal, I was excavating deeper into the HOA's financial labyrinth. And what I unearthed was more convoluted than a conspiracy theorist's fever dream. Remember that maintenance contract discrepancy? That was merely the opening act. The tennis court resurfacing agreement was the real masterwork. $200 monthly for a court that maybe 3 residents used and looked like it hadn't seen professional attention since the Bush administration. I contacted actual tennis court services and received quotes averaging $300 monthly, but apparently premium court maintenance justified quadruple market rates despite delivering results that suggested they maintained courts with garden hoses and sidewalk chalk. The landscaping contract was even more impressive. $4,500 monthly for comprehensive grounds management consisting of mowing 52 small yards and trimming some bushes. I've managed shopping complexes with smaller maintenance budgets, but apparently Greenspace Solutions provided premium services if you counted showing up sporadically and operating equipment like they were afraid of it. Then there were the legal expenses, $22,000 annually for routine compliance enforcement. Most HOAs spend maybe $3,000 yearly on legal matters, and that's when they're actually handling serious disputes. But apparently enforcing paint color regulations required the kind of legal firepower typically reserved for corporate litigation. My investigation began attracting neighborhood supporters. Robert, a retired Marine with hands that looked like they'd rebuilt half the machinery in America, appeared at my door one evening with a beer and some fascinating observations. Jennifer, a divorced mother working as a legal secretary, volunteered to assist with research. Even Reverend Thompson from the community church stopped by to express solidarity. Apparently, Victoria had attempted to cite the church for excessive vehicular congregation during Sunday services. But Victoria wasn't finished with her amateur intimidation campaign. She filed a police report claiming I'd aggressively confronted her and made threatening statements regarding her financial activities. Officer Martinez arrived looking like he'd prefer chasing actual criminals, reviewed my security footage, and quickly realized he was handling a fraudulent complaint. Word of advice, he said quietly while leaving. Document everything. I've encountered this pattern before, and it typically escalates before resolution. That's when Victoria committed her biggest error yet. She actually demanded Officer Martinez arrest me for disturbing the peace and intimidating a community official. Apparently, HOA vice president now qualified as public service. The officer's response was professional but definitive. Ma'am, questioning HOA finances isn't criminal behavior. Filing false police reports, however, definitely is. As Martinez departed and Victoria stomped back to her Tesla, I realized something crucial. I wasn't just confronting a petty dictator anymore. I was dealing with someone genuinely desperate. People don't escalate this aggressively unless they're hiding something significant. And concealed in Great Uncle Theodore's basement office, I was about to discover exactly what that something was. Victoria's desperation reached maximum velocity when she convened an emergency HOA board meeting with exactly 36 hours notice, which incidentally violates bylaws requiring 96-hour minimum notification. But desperate people ignore procedural details. They just bulldoze forward hoping nobody notices their legal catastrophe. The meeting occurred in Victoria's dining room, which immediately felt like being summoned to the principal's office, except the principal wore designer athleisure and burned scented candles costing more than most grocery budgets. She'd arranged furniture like a tribunal, positioning herself behind this enormous mahogany table that probably cost more than most vehicles. The agenda, printed on her property management company letterhead, contained exactly one item: emergency lien proceedings against 1847 Oak Street. Only 2 of the 5 board members attended. Apparently the others had developed sudden scheduling emergencies. Without a quorum, they couldn't legally authorize anything more significant than bathroom breaks. But Victoria charged ahead anyway, like a runaway train with malfunctioning brakes. That's when Eleanor appeared in the doorway like some avenging accounting angel. This woman, who'd been terrorized into silence for years, suddenly discovered her voice and started citing parliamentary procedures like she was reciting Shakespeare. Point of order. You cannot conduct official business without proper quorum. This meeting lacks procedural validity. Victoria's facade finally shattered completely. She screamed at Eleanor, literally screamed, calling her a meddling old witch and threatening citations for disrupting official proceedings. The transformation was spectacular. Suburban professional to raging autocrat in approximately 4 seconds. While Victoria was experiencing her public breakdown, I'd been having my private breakthrough. Jennifer's legal research had uncovered something that made my property management instincts tingle with recognition. Shell company relationships more tangled than holiday decorations in a storage closet. Greenspace Solutions wasn't some random contractor. It belonged to Victoria's brother-in-law, a 26-year-old whose previous work experience included managing a smoothie stand and getting terminated from a landscaping job for excessive absenteeism. Premium Court Maintenance was owned by Derek, who apparently learned tennis court maintenance from internet videos and boundless optimism. And Legal Advisory Partners LLC belonged to Victoria's sorority sister's law firm, specializing in what I'm charitably calling creative interpretations of property law. Every single vendor connected to Victoria's family or social network, all charging rates that would embarrass luxury hotels. I'd witnessed this exact fraud in commercial properties, board members directing contracts to associates while skimming profits like they're operating some suburban organized crime syndicate. But the real evidence emerged when I analyzed violation patterns across the community. Remember Victoria's selective enforcement? It wasn't random, it was surgical. She systematically targeted senior citizens, single parents, and anyone appearing vulnerable to intimidation. The Petersons got cited for displaying an unauthorized decorative lawn ornament, while the mansion 4 houses away had actual building code violations that never appeared on any inspection documentation. My informal gatherings at Murphy's Coffee were transforming into underground resistance meetings. 28 residents attended the latest session, sharing horror stories that painted a picture of systematic persecution. Mrs. Davidson described how Victoria had penalized her for excessive memorial displays after installing a small memorial garden for her deceased son. The Thompson family received citations for their children's sidewalk chalk art exceeding acceptable temporary decoration duration. Apparently, children's creativity was now a covenant violation. Robert's engineering evaluation of community infrastructure provided the final evidence against Victoria's operation. This man had constructed military installations overseas and maintained industrial equipment for 4 decades. When he identified problems, you listened carefully. His assessment read like forensic accounting horror story. Thousands charged for street repairs that never occurred, drainage improvements existing only on paper, and a security system consisting of one broken camera pointed at a decorative shrub. That's when Victoria went completely nuclear. She hired a private investigator, probably someone from the same discount detective service where Derek acquired his fake credentials, to excavate dirt on my background. Rumors started circulating faster than gossip at a church social. My military service was supposedly questionable. It wasn't. I was allegedly gang-affiliated because I'd lived in Florida. Apparently every Florida resident is automatically suspicious. And Great-Uncle Theodore had supposedly left me the house because I was blackmailing him, which would be remarkable considering he'd been deceased when I allegedly began. The racial implications weren't subtle. Victoria was exploiting every suburban anxiety she could imagine, portraying me as some kind of outside agitator threatening their precious community. She created anonymous social media accounts to spread these fabrications because nothing demonstrates credible community leadership like anonymous internet harassment. But while she was constructing her house of lies, I was building my fortress of evidence. Every meeting, every violation, every suspicious financial transaction was documented with the obsessive detail that would make forensic investigators weep with appreciation. Then Victoria played her ultimate desperate gambit, a certified letter claiming I owed $62,000 in special assessments for improvements, including a new community center, upgraded security infrastructure, and street renovations. None of these improvements actually existed, but payment was due within 2 weeks, or my property would face immediate lien action. I read that letter twice, then started laughing. Victoria had just provided exactly the kind of overreach I'd been anticipating. Time to demonstrate what happens when you pick a fight with someone who actually understands contract law. The court-ordered financial records arrived on a Tuesday morning that smelled like rain and justice. My attorney had executed some legal wizardry, and suddenly Victoria's carefully protected secrets were scattered across my kitchen table like evidence from a major criminal investigation. What I discovered made 2 decades of property management fraud cases appear like community theater amateur hour. Over $420,000 had disappeared from HOA accounts through an elaborate shell game that would have impressed professional con artists. Victoria hadn't just been skimming, she'd been operating a comprehensive money laundering scheme disguised as community management. Fabricated emergency assessments for projects existing only in her imagination, invoices for supplies never delivered, and payments to contractors who turned out to be relatives with recently created business licenses. But the real revelation was hidden in property title documentation. My attorney's team had been thorough, and buried in the mineral rights paperwork was a detail that made my coffee taste like victory. Great-Uncle Theodore's property included a small oil deposit. Nothing enormous, but sufficient that Carolina's Energy had been paying royalties for 4 years. Royalties that should have been flowing to the property owner. Royalties that had instead been diverted into HOA general funds with Victoria as sole account signatory. $26,000 of my money collected and spent without my knowledge or authorization. That single fact provided legal standing to demand complete forensic auditing of every HOA transaction since Victoria assumed control. The safe deposit box key had been hiding in plain sight, tucked inside Great-Uncle Theodore's vintage toolbox between instructions for carburetor repair and lawnmower maintenance. The box contained 6 years of meticulous documentation that would have made federal prosecutors weep with gratitude. Audio recordings of Victoria admitting to flexible accounting practices and working around restrictive financial regulations. Copies of forged homeowner approval forms on covenant modifications never actually voted upon. Bank statements documenting systematic theft disguised as legitimate community expenses. But the final document hit me like emotional lightning. Great-Uncle Theodore's last letter, written in his careful script just 3 weeks before his death. Marcus, if you're reading this, then Victoria Blackwood has probably attempted to destroy what remains of our neighborhood. I've collected everything possible, but I'm too sick and exhausted to continue this fight. Perhaps you have the strength I lack. All the evidence is here. Make them answer for what they've done to our friends. Suddenly, Great-Uncle Theodore's heart attack seemed less coincidental. His medical records, which I'd obtained through the estate settlement, showed dangerously elevated blood pressure beginning precisely when Victoria's harassment campaign intensified. The stress of battling this corruption had literally killed him, and Victoria had probably celebrated when her primary obstacle conveniently expired. My motivation transformed from personal vindication to something far deeper. This wasn't about paint colors or landscaping violations anymore. This was about honoring the memory of a man who'd spent his final months protecting neighbors from a predator. The evidence totaled multiple federal offenses: mail fraud, wire fraud, and embezzlement on a scale that would attract FBI attention. Her property management license violations were documented exhaustively. The total theft approached $580,000 when including inflated contracts, fraudulent assessments, and stolen royalty payments. But the beautiful irony was that Victoria remained oblivious to how much evidence existed. She thought she was managing one angry homeowner asking inconvenient questions. She had no idea that Great Uncle Theodore had spent years constructing an ironclad case against her, or that I now possessed every piece of that puzzle. The annual HOA meeting was legally mandatory and couldn't be canceled once proper notification was distributed. 68% of homeowners had to attend for major decisions, which meant I needed 36 people in that room. Based on my coffee shop intelligence network, I had confirmed commitments from 35 households and counting. Victoria was about to discover that her reign of terror was ending. She just didn't realize it yet. Great Uncle Theodore's workshop transformed into something between a command center and a federal evidence room. I'd cleared his workbench and covered it with file boxes, legal documents, and a timeline that resembled something from a criminal investigation series. Red thread connected photographs, financial records, and violation notices in a web that would have impressed detective fiction writers. Eleanor had designated herself my chief research coordinator, contributing homemade sandwiches and 45 years of accounting organizational expertise to the controlled chaos. Jennifer proved to be a legal research genius disguised as a single mother. She'd spent evenings at the law library, returning with case precedents and procedural knowledge that my attorney admitted surpassed most lawyers' capabilities. Her kitchen table was organized with color-coded binders: criminal violations in red, civil damages in blue, procedural violations in yellow. It resembled a rainbow of accountability. Assembling the legal team felt like recruiting the Justice League if the Justice League specialized in HOA fraud instead of battling supervillains. Patricia Williams was my lead attorney, 12 years of HOA law experience, and a reputation for making corrupt board members surrender in depositions. The forensic accountant she recommended could trace money through more shell companies than an international tax haven. We also had a private investigator specializing in financial crimes and a media relations consultant who previously produced investigative journalism before going independent. The state attorney general's office offered pro bono assistance, which told me everything needed about how seriously they treated HOA fraud. When government attorneys start volunteering their expertise, you know you've uncovered something more significant than neighborhood disputes. Community organizing evolved into a grassroots movement that would have impressed political campaign strategists. I visited every house like I was campaigning for office, explaining homeowner rights and sharing discoveries about Victoria's financial deception. The signal group Jennifer created expanded from 6 people to 42 within 3 weeks, with neighbors sharing evidence photographs and supporting each other through decades of accumulated intimidation. Reverend Thompson offered his church fellowship hall for strategy sessions, which provided our movement with moral authority that Victoria couldn't challenge. Robert contributed his engineering expertise and began documenting every infrastructure fabrication Victoria had perpetrated. His evaluation read like a criminal indictment, claimed street improvements that never occurred, drainage projects existing only on invoices, and a security system consisting of one malfunctioning camera aimed at a decorative fountain. The forensic accountant's investigation represented surgical precision applied to financial chaos. Every suspicious transaction was traced through bank records obtained via Attorney General subpoenas. The pattern was elegant in its simplicity. Fabricated invoices led to inflated payments, which flowed through family-controlled shell companies before landing in accounts managed by Victoria and her associates. The visual presentation he created resembled a flowchart for organized crime, which wasn't far from reality. Jennifer prepared sufficient legal documentation to overwhelm a courthouse: cease and desist orders for harassment, injunction paperwork to freeze HOA accounts, criminal referral packages for multiple agencies, and a class action framework for affected residents. She'd also drafted a homeowner petition to remove Victoria from leadership, citing financial mismanagement and breach of fiduciary responsibilities. My media strategy centered on Michael Torres, a local television reporter specializing in government corruption investigations. He'd been investigating HOA abuse throughout the region and embraced our story like investigative journalism gold. The regional newspapers showed interest too, especially after I mentioned the scale of financial fraud and elderly victims forced from their homes. The evidence compilation grew to 923 pages of financial documents, audio recordings, video evidence, and victim testimony. I'd learned from commercial property experience that judges appreciate visual presentations. We created before and after photographs showing promised improvements versus actual conditions. The contrast was devastating. Invoices for a clubhouse that didn't exist, bills for street work never performed, payments for landscaping that appeared maintained by intoxicated teenagers with broken equipment. I rehearsed my presentation with the community theater group meeting at Reverend Thompson's church because nothing prepares you for hostile audiences like amateur actors critiquing your performance. They helped me anticipate Victoria's probable responses and develop counter-arguments effective for cameras and legal observers. The technical knowledge I'd share with fellow homeowners was compiled into a guidebook that Jennifer designed, HOA Rights and Remedies. Basic information about demanding financial transparency, challenging discriminatory enforcement, and recognizing corruption warning signs. Most people don't understand that HOA boards carry the same fiduciary obligations as corporate directors, meaning personal liability for financial mismanagement. I remembered reading about a case in Arizona where board members paid restitution from personal assets after forensic auditing revealed systematic theft. The community center reservation was confirmed for the annual meeting with professional recording equipment and legal observers from the Attorney General's office. We'd arranged for media coverage because nothing encourages honesty like knowing behavior might appear on evening news. As I sat in Great Uncle Theodore's kitchen the night before confrontation, surrounded by corruption evidence and community support, I experienced something absent since my military service, the calm confidence accompanying thorough preparation and righteous purpose. Victoria had no comprehension of what was approaching. Victoria's reaction to discovering my growing coalition resembled watching a cornered predator realizing the trap was closing. The neighborhood communication network, more efficient than any intelligence operation, had apparently informed her that residents were organizing, and her response was complete psychological breakdown. First, she attempted canceling the annual meeting, claiming safety concerns and potential violence from external troublemakers. The irony was magnificent. The woman who'd been terrorizing elderly neighbors for years was suddenly concerned about her own security, but North Carolina state law is explicit about mandatory HOA meetings. Once proper notification is distributed, you can't simply decide democracy is inconvenient and abandon the process. She hired a security firm to intimidate residents, which backfired dramatically when the security supervisor realized what he was being asked to accomplish. Professional security personnel don't appreciate being used as enforcers in suburban HOA conflicts, especially when the employer can't provide coherent explanations of threats they're supposedly protecting against. The disinformation Victoria began spreading would have been amusing if it weren't so desperate. According to the Victoria Blackwood propaganda machine, I was organizing a violent uprising that would destroy property values and introduce dangerous elements into the community. She apparently informed Mrs. Rodriguez that I was coordinating gang infiltration of the neighborhood, which would have been news to my coalition of retired accountants, church volunteers, and military veterans. Meanwhile, her financial desperation was reaching critical levels. She'd attempted withdrawing the remaining $127,000 from HOA accounts, but the bank had frozen everything pending the Attorney General's investigation. When that failed, she tried destroying financial records, which added obstruction of justice to her expanding collection of federal crimes. She even attempted bribing the forensic accountant with property management contracts, apparently not realizing that offering financial incentives to expert witnesses in ongoing investigations is precisely the behavior that lands people in federal prison. The personal attacks escalated to stalking behavior that would have made obsessive ex-boyfriends jealous. Fake reviews appeared on every professional website I'd ever been associated with, claiming I was violent, unstable, and threatening peaceful residents. She attempted getting my vehicle registration suspended by filing false reports about unsafe modifications existing only in her imagination. Derek began following me to job interviews because apparently unemployed property managers still pose sufficient threats to require surveillance. Having your HOA vice president's husband lurking in parking lots while you're attempting career reconstruction adds a special dimension of harassment I wouldn't recommend. But the real escalation occurred when Victoria appeared at the grocery store where I was shopping, positioning herself at the end of every aisle like some suburban intelligence operative. When I finally confronted her about it, she claimed she was monitoring potential community threats. The store manager, bless him, informed her that following customers around his establishment was called stalking, and she needed to leave immediately. The violation notices she distributed to coalition members were masterworks of petty tyranny. Eleanor received citations for excessive wildlife feeding activity, allegedly attracting undesirable animals to the community. Jennifer was penalized for her children's bicycles being improperly stored in her own garage. Robert's veteran flag was written up for displaying unauthorized colors during non-federal observances. Elderly residents began receiving anonymous phone calls at all hours with whispered threats about consequences for troublemakers who didn't mind their own affairs. When Eleanor's car windshield mysteriously developed a spiderweb crack overnight, the message was unmistakable. Victoria was willing to escalate to property damage to maintain control. Jennifer discovered dead flowers on her doorstep with a note reading, "Mind your own business, or this could be you," about as subtle as a brick through a window, but with the cowardice of anonymous threats. When we filed police reports, Officer Martinez just shook his head and added them to what he called the Blackwood file. Apparently, we weren't her first victims. But while Victoria was busy playing suburban terrorist, I was documenting everything for additional criminal charges. Every threat, every vandalism act, every intimidation attempt was recorded, photographed, and filed with law enforcement. Her attorney, the sorority sister who'd been enabling this behavior for years, suddenly withdrew from representation when she realized the criminal liability exposure exceeded civil attorney capabilities. The replacement lawyer immediately attempted negotiating plea agreements through prosecutors, offering partial restitution in exchange for reduced charges. I refused any settlement excluding full restitution and criminal prosecution. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about justice for Great Uncle Theodore and protection for every future resident who might face Victoria's abuse. The community rallied in ways that restored faith in human decency. Yard signs appeared overnight, reading "Transparency in HOA Governance." Local business owners offered support and alternative meeting locations. A retired police detective volunteered security consultation for the upcoming confrontation. As the annual meeting approached, Victoria's desperation reached nuclear levels. But every desperate action she took only strengthened our case and unified the community against her. She was about to learn that terrorizing neighbors works temporarily until they stop being afraid and start getting angry. Victoria's final breakdown commenced when she realized criminal charges weren't just possible, they were inevitable. The FBI Financial Crimes Division had initiated inquiries. The state attorney general's office was constructing a prosecution case, and her own attorney had essentially terminated her for being too toxic to represent. Her response was attempting what I can only describe as a strategic retreat to desperation land. She tried fleeing to her mother's house in Virginia, apparently believing crossing state lines would somehow make federal mail fraud charges disappear. Unfortunately for her escape plan, the court had frozen her credit cards as part of asset seizure proceedings, and her Tesla broke down somewhere outside Charlotte. Nothing says criminal mastermind like getting stranded on I-85 because you can't afford roadside assistance. When she slunk back to Pine Ridge Commons 72 hours later, looking like she'd been living in a parking garage, which she probably had, neighbors were observing from windows like they were witnessing the world's least competent fugitive returning from a failed escape attempt. That's when she made her most desperate gambit yet. A direct bribery attempt so clumsy it would have made organized crime figures cringe. She appeared at my door at midnight with a gym bag containing $75,000 in cash, claiming it was compensation for any misunderstandings I'd experienced. The woman actually used the phrase, "Let's resolve this misunderstanding like professionals," while offering me a bag of money like some kind of suburban crime boss. What she didn't know was that I was wearing recording equipment for the FBI. Agent Rodriguez had suggested it after Victoria's failed escape attempt, and apparently my property management background made me naturally suited for undercover operations. The recording was magnificent, 52 minutes of Victoria confessing to borrowing HOA funds, admitting to creating fraudulent assessments, and explaining how she'd been creative with accounting procedures to fund her lifestyle. My personal favorite moment was when she said, "You understand how these communities function, right? The homeowners are sheep who need someone to make difficult decisions for them. I was providing essential leadership services." The FBI agent monitoring through my earpiece probably broke equipment from gripping it too hard. The attempted bribery added another felony to her collection, but more importantly, provided a confession that would make prosecution absolutely bulletproof. She just handed federal prosecutors enough evidence to lock her away and lose the key. Meanwhile, community solidarity had reached levels that would have made labor organizers weep with pride. 43 of 52 households were now openly supporting our movement, with only 9 holdouts, all owned by Victoria's relatives or people who owed her favors. The community fund we'd established to assist elderly residents with legal expenses had grown to $18,000, mostly from small donations, proving our neighbors were willing to support their principals financially. The local bakery owner donated refreshments for the upcoming meeting. The hardware store offered materials for repairing vandalism damage. Even the postal carrier started reporting suspicious activity around coalition members' homes. Apparently, federal employees take mail tampering extremely seriously. National attention was building, too. HOA reform organizations had discovered our story through social media, and suddenly we were receiving support calls from communities battling similar corruption nationwide. The hashtag Theodore's Army was trending in property management circles, which isn't exactly mainstream fame, but felt pretty satisfying to those of us fighting suburban tyranny. Victoria's professional life collapsed like a controlled demolition. Her property management firm terminated her contract immediately after the bribery attempt became public. The state licensing board suspended her pending investigation. Former clients began filing complaints about unethical behavior spanning years. She filed for personal bankruptcy to conceal assets, which only made federal prosecutors more interested in where those assets might be hidden. The supreme irony was that her own townhouse went into foreclosure. The woman who'd been threatening foreclosure against neighbors couldn't make her own mortgage payments once her criminal enterprise was exposed. Karma doesn't achieve much more poetic justice than that. Her final stand strategy was pure desperation theater. She planned claiming I was an outside agitator sent to destroy the community, blaming everything on the management company and bringing Derek plus 4 relatives as support to pack the meeting with allies. She even attempted recruiting supporters from neighboring HOAs, promising them that outside interference in their communities could be next if they didn't stand together. But while she was scrambling to create the illusion of support, I was adding finishing touches to a presentation that would end her reign of terror permanently. The forensic accountant's report was crystal clear and visually devastating. The attorney's legal analysis identified 15 separate felonies with ironclad evidence. Robert's engineering assessment proved thousands wasted on imaginary infrastructure projects. The private investigator's surveillance had documented ongoing financial crimes in real time. The night before the annual meeting, I visited Great Uncle Theodore's grave one final time. I told him about the evidence we'd gathered, the community we'd united, and the justice we were about to deliver. The September evening was warm and peaceful, crickets beginning their nightly symphony above the headstone. Tomorrow, Victoria Blackwood would face the reckoning that Great Uncle Theodore had started building years before his death, and I was going to ensure every second honored his memory. The community center on the morning of the annual meeting hummed with the kind of electric anticipation you feel before lightning strikes. By 6:30 a.m., residents were already gathering with folding chairs and travel mugs, settling in like they were claiming premium seating for the neighborhood event of the century. The aroma of fresh coffee mixed with nervous energy and the faint scent of floor polish from the center's overnight cleaning. 78 residents packed into a space designed for maybe 60, with local media crews establishing cameras in the rear, like they were covering a mayoral election instead of a suburban HOA meeting. Michael Torres from the television station had his equipment ready, and the regional newspaper had dispatched their investigative reporter. Apparently, HOA corruption was becoming evening news material. Victoria arrived 30 minutes late in what could only be described as a tactical entrance, flanked by Derek and 4 relatives who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. She'd clearly spent the morning attempting to reclaim some appearance of authority, wearing a charcoal business suit that screamed, "I'm still in control," and carrying a briefcase that probably contained more legal threats than actual legal substance. Her opening strategy was immediately seizing control of the meeting, citing procedural authority and board privileges like some kind of suburban dictator reading from a constitutional monarchy playbook. She announced that the first order of business was removing me from the community for disruptive behavior and threatening community security. That's when Eleanor stood up like an avenging angel of parliamentary procedure. "Point of order," she called out in a voice that could probably be heard 4 blocks away. "Under North Carolina state law and our own bylaws, this meeting must allow homeowner input before any business can be conducted. You cannot simply remove residents without due process." The room erupted in applause and shouts of support that made Victoria's face cycle through more colors than a neon sign having an electrical malfunction. She tried restoring order by banging a gavel she didn't actually have authority to use, but the crowd was having none of it. I took the floor, with the calm confidence that comes from having overwhelming evidence and nothing left to lose. I began with a tribute to Great Uncle Theodore, explaining how his love for this community had inspired him to spend his final years gathering evidence of corruption that would protect his neighbors from financial predation. The visual presentation hit like a precision strike. Financial charts showing the systematic theft of $580,000. Before and after photographs of promised improvements that existed only on inflated invoices, audio recordings of Victoria admitting to creative accounting procedures and calling residents sheep who need someone to make difficult decisions for them. The audience reaction was everything I'd hoped for and more. Gasps of outrage when they realized the scope of the theft. Audible weeping from elderly residents who finally understood why they'd been targeted. Angry shouts when the discriminatory patterns of Victoria's enforcement became clear. But the moment that defined everything came when Victoria tried interrupting the presentation. She jumped up screaming about lies and forgeries and conspiracy theories designed to destroy our community. Then she made the fatal mistake of playing the race card, suggesting that neighbors couldn't trust his type to understand traditional community standards. The room went dead silent for about 4 seconds, then exploded in unified outrage. These were people who had lived together for decades, who'd watched each other's children grow up and supported each other through divorces and deaths and deployments. They knew exactly what Victoria was implying, and they weren't having it. The smoking gun moment came when I played the audio recording from her bribery attempt. Her own voice, clear as a church bell, admitting to years of financial manipulation. I was providing essential leadership services by being creative with accounting procedures. These people don't understand how communities really function. Derek tried claiming the recording was illegal, but my attorney, Patricia Williams, was ready with chapter and verse of North Carolina law confirming single-party consent for recording conversations. Victoria's face went through what I can only describe as the 5 stages of grief in Fast Forward. Detective Morrison from the Financial Crimes Unit had been observing from the back of the room and stepped forward to announce that formal charges were already being prepared. The FBI was reviewing evidence for federal prosecution. The state attorney general's office was pursuing civil penalties. Victoria's property management license was permanently revoked. The community vote was swift and merciless. Unanimous removal of the entire board with Victoria and her allies walking out in defeat. Temporary leadership appointed with me as financial oversight chairman. Criminal prosecution approved by acclamation. Independent management company hired to prevent future corruption. As TV cameras captured Victoria's final meltdown, screaming about conspiracies and lawsuits while Derek physically restrained her from attacking anyone, I delivered the line I'd been practicing for weeks. My great-uncle Theodore taught me that communities are built on trust, not fear. Today, we reclaim our community. The standing ovation lasted 6 minutes and felt like vindication for every elderly resident who'd been bullied, every family forced from their home, and every neighbor too afraid to speak up. Until now. Justice served at exactly room temperature in a community center that smelled like coffee and victory. 8 months later, the headlines told the complete story. Former HOA vice president sentenced to 5 years federal prison for embezzlement and mail fraud. Victoria's guilty plea had come after her new attorney, a competent one this time, explained that fighting the evidence would be like arguing with physics. Derek received 24 months as an accomplice, and her brother-in-law's landscaping company collapsed after the IRS discovered some creative interpretations of tax law that made Victoria's HOA accounting look amateur. The asset seizure recovered $387,000 through bank accounts, real estate holdings, and that ridiculous Tesla that had become the unofficial symbol of suburban tyranny. We used the recovered funds to actually improve the community. Imagine that concept. The tennis court got professionally resurfaced for the first time in years, looking like something you'd actually want to play on instead of a cracked concrete wasteland. Monthly HOA fees dropped from $220 to $125, proving that honest management costs significantly less than criminal enterprise overhead. The new community garden we built with recovered funds became a symbol of what neighborhoods can accomplish when they work together, instead of being terrorized by petty dictators. Children who'd been cited for sidewalk chalk art were now planting vegetables in raised beds purchased with money their tormentor had tried to steal. Poetry in motion, if you ask me. Marcus Property Solutions and Community Consulting, my new business, took off faster than I'd expected. Turns out communities across the Carolinas were dealing with similar corruption, and word spreads quickly in HOA circles when someone actually knows how to fight back legally. I specialized in forensic financial analysis and helping communities recover from board abuse. 31 clients in the first year with recovered funds totaling over $3.2 million. Not bad for a guy who'd been unemployed and homeless 8 months earlier. The ripple effects went statewide. North Carolina passed the Theodore Act. Okay, they didn't actually name it after my uncle, but everyone knew where the inspiration came from, requiring public financial audits for any HOA community over 30 homes. The legislation included whistleblower protections and criminal penalties for board members who misappropriate funds. Other states began introducing similar legislation because apparently suburban financial corruption was more widespread than anyone wanted to acknowledge. Theodore's Memorial Garden became the heart of our transformed community. We converted the space next to the community center into a memorial garden with his favorite azaleas, plus a tool library where neighbors could borrow equipment and share maintenance advice. The stray dogs still got fed daily. Tradition is tradition, and the community fund we'd established provided assistance for elderly residents facing financial hardship. Eleanor appointed herself unofficial community archivist, documenting our transformation from fear-based dictatorship to actual democracy. Jennifer completed her law degree and started a nonprofit organization helping HOA abuse victims across the region. Robert led the infrastructure committee with actual engineering expertise, ensuring that when we paid for improvements, we actually received improvements worth paying for. The second annual Theodore Day drew over 300 attendees, including families from neighboring communities who'd heard our story and wanted to see what positive change looked like. Local news covered the transformation, focusing on how ordinary people can create extraordinary change when they refuse to accept abuse as normal. The documentary film crew that showed up last month was particularly interested in the legal strategy we'd used. Apparently, our case was becoming a template for HOA reform nationwide, studied in law schools and cited in court cases from Oregon to Georgia. Great Uncle Theodore would have gotten a kick out of knowing his evidence gathering was being taught to future attorneys. But the best part was walking through the neighborhood on summer evenings, seeing kids playing in yards without fear of violation notices, elderly residents tending gardens without harassment, and neighbors talking to each other instead of hiding behind curtains. The aroma of barbecue replaced the stench of fear, and the sound of laughter echoed where there used to be whispered complaints. Property values increased 15%. Turns out that honest management and community trust are better for real estate prices than tyrannical enforcement of arbitrary rules. Who could have predicted that? Sometimes the system works, but only when good people stand up and make it work. My great Uncle Theodore taught me that communities are worth fighting for, and that David can beat Goliath with the right slingshot: evidence, law, and community solidarity. So drop a comment about your HOA nightmare, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Subscribe for more stories about ordinary people fighting extraordinary corruption. Remember, you have more power than you think, but only if you're willing to use it. Next week's story. Karen tried to tow my motorcycle. She had no idea I own the entire parking lot. Thank you for tuning in to HOA Chronicles, where neighbors stand up against HOA Karens and karma comes knocking. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, share your thoughts below, and subscribe for more HOA tales and real-life neighborhood drama each week.